three papers that are going to be presented. And so we're going to start with a paper by Mario Dota from Sao Paulo School of Economics, and his paper's name is Commodity Booms in the Environment. So take it away, Mario. You have 25 minutes.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So, okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. So this paper is by Daniel da Mata and myself. We are both from the São Paulo School of Economics, and the paper, as Daniel mentioned, is named Commodity Booms in the Environment. So what do we do here? We basically study the carbon footprint of a strong shift in agricultural commodity prices in the 2000s and 2010s on some environmental outcomes. And we do that for Brazil. Okay, so Brazil is our setting, and I'm going to explain a little bit further why is that so. So we investigate whether booms induce agricultural production responses towards higher or lower greenhouse gas emissions. And we show that localities more exposed to booms, they have, in fact, deforested more, they have had more fire occurrences, and they have emitted more greenhouse gas emissions. We also analyze how economic shocks or economic booms influence compliance with voluntary climate mitigation policy, which was in place in Brazil, which is in place in Brazil, but has changed a little bit. And we find that localities more exposed to the commodity shock, they complied less with such policies. What is our motivation here? So over the past centuries, over most of human history, periods of economic prosperity have typically happened to the detriment of the environment. And deforestation, fires, pollution are just examples of how human activities end up impacting the environment. Climate change is the ultimate result of man-made environmental degradation via greenhouse gas emissions from human economic activities. And we are here interested in a particular sector of the economy, which is the food production sector, which accounts for 25 to 35% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, which is a great share of all emissions that take place yearly. And to study these relationships, we choose Brazil because Brazil is one of the main food suppliers to the world. It's relevant in grains, soybeans, maize, coffee, orange, and many other foodstuffs, and animal protein as well, such as beef, chicken, and other animal products. Brazil also holds the Amazon forest, and has an agricultural frontier in the Cerrado, which is Brazil's savanna. Both of these biomes, the Amazon and the Cerrado, represent about 70% of the national territory in Brazil. So Brazil's environmental preservation has consequences for the world at large. And Brazil has also implemented some mitigation policies to reduce environmental costs associated with economic activities. So what are our research questions in this paper? We want to answer the following. Do commodity booms come at an environmental cost? And for that, we study the carbonizing factors which lead to net positive GHG emissions, such as deforestation, cattle raising activities, and decarbonizing factors, which lead to lower greenhouse gas emissions, such as higher crop productivity or a different crop mix. Subsequently, we want to investigate whether or not climate mitigation policies can be influenced by economic booms. And we know that mitigation policies have been falling short of intended goals worldwide, because the UN has been telling us that. And in particular, in Brazil, we investigate the Low Carbon Agriculture Plan, or ABC plan in Portuguese. ABC because Agricultura de Baixo Carbono in Portuguese. Okay. And our main contribution here is providing an in-depth analysis of the carbon footprint of a period of economic boom in Brazil, and assessing how commodity booms end up affecting compliance with such mitigation policies. Okay. Our work relates to several strands of the literature. I'm going to be really quick here just to move on to the econometrics and our results. But basically, we relate our work to the effect of economic growth on environmental outcomes, to the impacts of economic activity on climate change, some seminal contributions by Stern, Nordhaus, climate change mitigation policies, literature as well, and on the causes and consequences of deforestation and fires, and now of GHG emissions as well. So what's our empirical strategy? This is an empirical paper. So we choose a shift share design, exposure design, and our main specification is given by equation 1 there, where I stands for municipality. We have about 5,570 municipalities in Brazil, and T stands for time. And our time frame here is from 2001 to 2017. So this is our outcome variable. Y is, of course, the dependent variable here. We used fixed effects for municipalities and fixed effects for time. We include a set of time-varying geoclimatic variables, such as basically rain and temperatures here, because they need to be, of course, exogenous. And we also include a set of socioeconomic variables, initial socioeconomic variables, such as population size, urbanization rates, poverty, unemployment, and some other controls. We cluster our standard errors at the municipal level because that's where the level of variation is at. And we are interested in the beta coefficient here, which will give us the elasticity to the exposure index, which is this commodity exposure. CE stands for commodity exposure for municipality I at time T. And I'm going to explain in the next slide what that is exactly. So we define the commodity exposure index as the sum of the share of total production in tons pre-commodity boom for crop or livestock K in municipality I, multiplied by the real international commodity prices for crop K at time T. And the sum across K gives us the commodity exposure index for municipality I at time T. This is our main specification. We also have two other alternative exposure specifications. One that considers not the share of total production in tons, but the employment shares, and the other which considers predicted shares using FAO-GAES data. Our main identifying assumption here is that localities would have had similar outcomes in the absence of the boom. Okay. We then construct a data panel containing information on all our interested variables. The main one is greenhouse gas emissions, which comes from the Observatório do Clima, Brazil's Observatório do Clima, or the Climate Observatory. They estimate greenhouse gas emissions for Brazil's municipalities yearly. So this is yearly data. We also gather the number of fires from Brazil's Space Agency database. We collect deforestation data by municipality also from PRODES system and Terra Brasilis system. These are both systems from Brazil's Space Agency to identify deforestation in Brazil's territory. We build the commodity exposure index containing data from the Brazil Bureau of Statistics, IBGE, from the survey of municipal livestock, the survey of agricultural livestock, World Bank data for commodities prices, and we deflate that and bring that to Brazilian reais because farmers in Brazil who decide whether or not to produce more, they have their money in Brazilian reais, not in US dollars. So that's a step that we take. We also gather rural credit data from Brazil Central Bank, rural credit matrix, and we gather a lot of additional data for controls and testing, such as the number of tractors, areas for crops, rangeland, which is pasture land, no-till cultivated area, population, temperature, and many other variables which are of interest and which I'm gonna show later on. So what crops and livestock do we select to build our commodity exposure index? We select 9 of them. And the reason is that they represent a great share of production value in Brazil. So we select basically bovines, maize, bananas, sugar, rice, orange, soy, coffee, and cocoa. And these 9 commodities, they represent 70 to 80% of production value in Brazil. They are widespread produced. So we have about 5,500 municipalities in Brazil, and these are the number of municipalities which have produced these commodities in at least 1 year, either 2006 or 2017. Okay. This is the percentage change in the number of municipalities from 2006 to 2017, which produce each of the products here. And these are the price changes in US dollars for each of the commodities over the same period. Okay. Figure 1 here presents the price index in BRL, in Brazilian reais, over the period of analysis from 2001 to 2017. This is the 12-month moving average. So we see a sharp increase in prices over here. And figure B shows the commodity exposure index for 2010, so that we can see how, a cross-section variation here of how the commodity exposure index changes in Brazil, across Brazil. So now I'm going to present the results. We run equation 1 for many variables, and we show the effects of commodity booms on first economic activity, deforestation and fires, then on land allocation, crop mix productivity, then on greenhouse gas emissions. Then we make an exercise to show how commodity booms impact climate mitigation policy given by the ABC program, which I'm going to describe a little further next. And we also show the results on the biomes, specific to biomes, the Amazon and the Cerrado, which are Brazil's most important biomes. And we separate the effects of crops and livestock to see which has a greater impact on each of the variables. We transform our outcome variables and our commodity exposure index using log+1, and we perform a series of robustness checks just to see if that holds. We use log+1 because we have some zeros in the database. Okay. So first of all, these are the impacts on economic activity, deforestation, and fires. So we first investigate how exposure changes agricultural area. And 1% increase in exposure changes in about 0.9% here, the agricultural area. So I present results with no controls and with controls, okay? So these are, just for disclosure, these are the results with controls and without controls. So it's a sharp positive response here. Also a positive response for agricultural GDP and for deforestation and the number of fires. So more exposed localities tend to have more deforestation and more fires on average, as well as some other extensive economic impacts. Okay, this is our first result. Then we are interested in how decarbonizing factors that we just showed above, so commodity prices increase, deforestation increases, fire increase, and also agricultural GDP and agricultural area. So these are all extensive and carbonizing factors of commodity booms. We want to understand whether or not there are some intensive results as well, which might mitigate future impacts of commodity prices. So first, we want to see whether or not pasture land as a percentage of total farmland increases. And in fact, we have in more exposed localities an increase in the percentage of pasture land as a total of farmland. This is what this first result is showing here. At the same time, the productivity of pasture land measured by the number of heads of cattle per hectare in that land presents a negative relationship to exposure. So what is going on here is another carbonizing effect, because now we have a greater share of pasture land with a lower productivity in that land. However, when you look at crops, the opposite is going on here at this time frame. So crop production per hectare, which is this variable that we have here, presents a positive response to exposure, meaning that more exposed localities are now more productive in crop production. They also are more capitalized because now they have a greater number of tractors per hectare when they are more exposed to booms. And finally, we want to see whether or not this type of crops are more related to lower emissions or higher emissions. And this is our last variable here. We select some crops which are considered to have a lower impact on the environment and a lower carbon footprint. And we see whether or not these crops have increased their area and their area of production. And we see that more exposed localities now produce more crops which have a lower impact on GHG emissions. So taken together, these are what we call decarbonizing factors of commodity booms here. A higher productivity, a different crop mix, which tends toward lower emission crops, and also some measure of capital per hectare, which is also important. Okay. What are the net effects that we have here? Then we go to the greenhouse gas emissions variables. So basically, more exposed localities, they tend to have higher emissions of measured as gross emissions. Okay. This means that when a locality is more exposed to the commodity boom, it's likely emitting more gross emissions. But gross emissions are not only from agriculture or from agriculture-related activities. They are also for the whole economy. And this is to expect, of course, because Brazil is a commodity-dependent country and the commodity sector has spillovers all over the economy. In addition, we also showed that agricultural GHG emissions increase. Land use GHG emissions also increase. And these are related to change in land use, meaning deforestation and fires, which confirm our results above. And overall, net GHG emissions also increase. What is the difference between gross and net GHG emissions? Is that net GHG emissions consider also removal of GHG emissions from natural and man-made activities, such as planting a forest, for instance. Okay. So overall, we have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions when municipalities are more exposed to booms. Okay. Then we investigate the mitigation policy, the climate mitigation policy program. So just to give you some background, and I'm running short on time here, I think. In 2010, the government launched a program in Brazil to reduce GHG emissions in agriculture, named Agricultura de Baixo Carbono Plan, or Low Carbon Agriculture Plan. And basically provides subsidized credit for low or net zero GHG emission management practices and investments in farming and livestock. So it finances, for instance, no-till planting, which is a type of planting that you do that does not disturb the land, thus stocking carbon, for instance, in the land, and also finances the conversion of degraded pasture land into productive pasture crops. Also, the implementation of integrated systems of crops, livestock, and forests, and equipment for machinery and production-related infrastructure. Due to data constraints, we analyze the program in a different time period of relatively low crop prices, but higher beef prices, which is 2013 to 2017. And we changed the endowment share of our exposure index to 2008 to 2012. So what are the results that we have? First, we run our new exposure on overall traditional credit lines for agriculture. And we see that farmers in more exposed localities, they took up more credit. However, they took up less credit related to the ABC credit line, which means that they responded to the boom positively, taking credit, but they did not take credit related to the to environmentally friendly practices, for instance. And we dug a little deeper just to see whether or not the management practices related to the ABC credit had increased in such areas. But due to data constraints as well, we just run here. This is panel data. This is a cross-section for the year 2017, but we ran it either way. And we got a negative response of the exposure index to no till area. So no till area, which is considered sustainable and financed by the ABC credit, had a negative relationship to it. And also well-managed pasture land, which we name here good pasture, also has a negative relationship to exposure. So this shows the consistency of our results for the ABC credit, of course. And what is the net effect of GHG emissions in such municipalities? It's still positive as we had shown before. Okay, so the economy here can impact compliance with climate mitigation policy, especially if that policy is voluntary. Okay. Then we investigate.
5 minutes, Mario.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So just showing you some further results, we investigate the specific impacts on the Cerrado and Amazon biomes. Okay. So blue and red for the Amazon, black and brown for the Cerrado. We see that as a response to exposure, the Amazon has a lower response to deforestation when compared to the Cerrado. However, it has a higher response to fires when compared to the Cerrado. And this, we're still investigating this further, but this has to do with the dynamic of deforestation and the activities that subsequently are implemented in each of the biomes. Most likely the Cerrado biome is more related to crop expansion, while the Amazon biome is more related to cattle raising expansion. That's why you have a higher number of fires in the Amazon, which are not natural to the Amazon. Okay. And again, just to confirm our previous results, both present positive responses to the net GHG emission variable. Okay. And digging a little deeper, we separate the effects of the commodity exposure to bovines, to livestock, and to crop. And we see that now blue and red are bovine exposure, and black and brown is crop exposure. So we see that deforestation is much more related to bovine exposure than to crop exposure. And fires also are more related to bovine exposure, and we don't find any effects for crop exposure here. And again, both are related to net positive exposure, net positive GHG emissions when exposed more, of course. So this result also suggests that our previous results hold. Okay. And we run a lot of robustness checks, and our results remain largely robust to those checks. So we run alternative commodity exposure indices. We run some inference checks by ADAM, and we cluster at micro and mesoregions. We run for pre-trends in forested areas, which is what we have data for. We run sensitivity tests for a period in which the commodity boom had not yet fully started. We run different specification tests. We run some placebos, some transformation of the dependent variable, alternative definition of spatial units, and we scale up the dependent variables just to see what happens. And again, our results remain largely robust to these checks. We talk about them more in the paper. So basically, what we find here is that commodity booms are associated with carbonizing factors such as deforestation, fires, higher GHG emissions, cattle raising activities, and also to decarbonizing factors such as higher crop productivity, changes toward lower emission crops, changing the crop mix. And these results, they highlight that market forces can promote GHG emissions and GHG mitigation, but we need to consider the several pathways through which economic growth can affect these emissions, of course. And we also show that mitigation policies may be affected by periods of economic growth. And these are basically our results here. Thank you all for watching me, and that's basically it. Okay.
Thank you, Mario, for this great presentation. So I suggest that we go on to Gabriel's presentation. So Gabriel, while you set up your slides, so Gabriel Facundes Monteiro, he is going to present a paper that is Migration and Crop Change Evidence from Brazil using a spatial equilibrium model. So take it away, Gabriel. You have 25 minutes.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a work in progress paper, an early work in progress paper with Jaqueline Oliveira and Paula Pereda. This paper is a result from my master thesis, and we will be working on this on the next years, I don't know. So any comments are very welcome. So the main goal of this work is to model and assess internal migration and crop change as adaptation mechanisms to climate change in Brazil. So when we do that, we are thinking about an economy with workers and firms in agriculture and non-agricultural sector and a housing market. And in our model, the workers will choose the location to live and the sector to work, given the local amenities and labor market conditions. So workers will be impacted by climate change, initially via the local amenities. And the farmers, they choose the crops which will be produced at each given location, given the farm gate prices, and the crop suitability to the local agroclimatic conditions. So the farmers here, they are being directly affected by the climate change via the crop productivities at each location. To illustrate that, here we have first the predicted change in summer and winter average temperatures in Brazil by microregion. And as you can see, as Brazil is a country of continental dimensions, we have regions that will be less impacted by climate change. Some regions that are expected even to have decreases in average temperatures during parts of the year. But we have also regions like the Brazilian Midwest, which will face very steep increases in expected temperatures during winter and during summer. And this affects the worker's choice of location in our model. Whereas for crops, what we see is that different crops are affected differently by changes in climate. So here we have wheat and coffee in our high emission scenario. And what we see is that coffee, although it's expected to lose productivity in most of the Brazilian territory, in some parts of the Brazilian Southeast and of the Brazilian South, the coffee productivity is expected to go up in this climate scenario. And about wheat, what we see is that it's expected to lose productivity in all Brazilian territory. But the places where it is expected to lose productivity the most is exactly the ones where coffee is expected to fare better. So it's exactly parts of the Southeast and of the south of Brazil. So to discipline our interpretation here, we use a model for the location choice of workers, for the agriculture and non-agriculture firms, and the housing market. So we consider an economy with J locations into sectors of employment, agriculture and non-agriculture. Each location, a microregion, presents a prospective indirect utility to workers, which is a function of the wage in the location and sector, the housing rent prices, and climatic, non-climatic, and sector of employment amenities. The workers want to live in the location and work in the sector which provide them the highest indirect utilities, and they can move across locations. However, to move across locations, they need to pay a migration cost. So a worker who wants to migrate from microregion J to microregion K will have to pay fixed utility costs and a cost that increases with the distance between these two locations. So the workers, they have this indirect utility, they have the migration costs, and they also have an idiosyncratic taste shock from which we can extract the migration probabilities of migrating from region J to region K to work in sector S, which follows this former tier that depends on the indirect utility of the location sector, the migration costs, and our parameter sigma here. The agriculture firm in our model can produce up to n distinct goods, which are the crops. The production function of the firms for each crop follows Cobb-Douglas type with constant returns to scale, where we have labor and land as our inputs. And this production function also has a total factor of productivity here, which depends on the local, the agroclimatic conditions of the place to this specific crop. The distribution of cropland shares comes from the farmers trying to maximize their profits at each parcel of land at which they produce. So the share of land at each location occupied by the crop M will depend on the farm gate price of this crop, the crop suitability to this location, and this cropland share elasticity parameter here. The wage in the agriculture sector will be a function of the labor land ratio in that location, the prices, crop suitability of each crop to that location, and the distribution of the crops in this microregion. The non-agriculture firm in our model uses a Cobb-Douglas production function with only labor as an input. So the wage in the non-agriculture sector will depend only on the labor supply, and the housing rent here in our model will depend on the land value at that location, which is impacted by the agricultural productivity because the farmers also rent land or buy land to produce, okay? And it will depend on the housing demand at the location, okay? So now, step by step, how does climate change enters in our model? First, climate change has a direct impact on climatic amenities and crop productivities. Then farmers respond by reallocating their inputs according to the new optimal set of crops for the new climate. The changes in agriculture demand for labor and land will impact agricultural wages and the housing rental prices. Workers then evaluate their prospective indirect utilities based on the new climatic amenities, wages, and housing prices, and they will choose their location sector pairs considering the migration costs from moving from place to another. As the workers migrate, the wages and rent adjust by local supply and demand, which will further alter the locational choices, and a new equilibrium will be reached when no one has incentives to migrate anymore. Okay, so which data we use in our analysis? The main data which we use will be, first, the Brazilian decennial population census, from which we extract the hourly wage rate of workers, the sector of employment, the housing rent, the municipality of residence, and the municipality of residence 5 years prior to the census year. Okay, so with the municipality of residence information and the municipality of residence 5 years prior to the census is how we get the migration flows in our model. We use the 2006 agricultural census to get the farm gate prices, the crop yields, and the crop production areas. We use the global agroecological zones to get the agroclimatic attainable yields under the baseline climate and under future climate scenarios. So this is how we get the crop suitability to each location. And we also use the Brazilian Space Institute data for historical daily weather data and future climate forecasts for our climate change scenarios. So to get our parameters, first we calibrate our labor share cost in agriculture and the housing share cost for workers using data from previous studies, and we estimate the remaining parameters first by the parameter from the agriculture production function, the cropland share distribution. Then we estimate the migration costs using the equation of the probability of migrating from a region to another region. And we estimate the remaining parameters from the indirect utilities, agriculture firm, and housing market using these equations below. So here we have our estimation of the land share elasticity, or the price and the cropland shares here, they are endogenous. So because of that, we need to use an instrumental variable. And what we use as our instrumental variable is an interaction of an index of crop exposure, to foreign markets, and a distance of this region to a major port for agricultural products in Brazil. Okay, so we use a national index and a location index. And as a result, what we have for our land share elasticity here is this parameter of 1.117, which is a low land elasticity in the literature. For example, Cousineau in his paper finds a parameter of 2, and the parameter found by Sotelo in Peru is also larger than this. So this indicates a large land heterogeneity, land productivity heterogeneity in Brazil. Here we have our migration costs. What we see is a a high fixed utility cost of migrating. And we have also an increasing cost with distance. The remaining parameters are estimated using a log first difference form. And we also use instruments here. What we use will be a measure of labor market access, a Bartik shock, and an indicative variable for having a large labor market in a period previous to our analysis, and agricultural revenue shift share, and an interaction of the shift share with log distance to coast. Okay. And this is the parameters that we capture. We capture that an increase in wages promotes an increase in the indirect utility of workers, which attracts workers to the location. An increase in summer temperature is a disamenity for workers, but an increase in winter temperatures increase the workers' indirect utility. As expected, an increase in labor supply decreases local wages in the sector, the non-agricultural sector, and an increase in land and inland value and an increase in housing demand also affect positively the housing rent price in locations. So here we have the results of our simulation. First, I present here results of how cropland shares respond to climate change. But I must say that at the moment, our goodness of fit of the cropland share equation is bad. It's something that we are trying to improve. But however, we can still understand that what we see here is a result of the crop suitabilities predicted by your database. Okay, so what we have here is that coffee is predicted to increase its production area in the south and southeast regions of Brazil, but decrease its production area in the rest of the country. While maize is predicted to have an increase of production in parts of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the north of Brazil, and a decrease of production in the south and southeast of the country. In terms of migration and agriculture share of employment, we have the results for both low emission scenarios and for high emission scenarios. And what we see is that climate change is predicted to increase the aggregate migration rate in Brazil across microregions and decrease the agriculture share of employment. Crop change, which is our form of agricultural adaptation here, does not impact the migration rate very much. It has a very marginal effect in one of the scenarios only, but it has an effect on the agriculture share of employment. Okay, so when we have agricultural adaptation via crop change, we expect to have less reduction in the agriculture share of employment. We also have the results for the Brazilian macro regions, and we see very different impacts of climate change for different microregions in Brazil. For example, the Northeast region of the country, one of the poorest regions, will be the most impacted by climate change in terms of out-migration from the region. But the Southeast region of Brazil which is the richer one, is expected to have less out-migration when we have climate change compared to a scenario where we stay with the baseline climate. Okay. And in terms of agriculture share of employment, what we see is that the North and Northeast regions of Brazil are the ones to be more severely impacted by climate change in terms of reduction of agriculture share of employment. The one to be most impacted depends on which scenario we are at. At the low emission scenarios, the Northeast region is the one to lose more agricultural employment. And in the high emissions scenario, we have the North region losing a greater share of agricultural employment. However,
Gabriel,
we
you
see
have
that
5 minutes.
okay. However, we see that the South macro region of Brazil is the one where we can expect crop change to have the greatest potential to mitigate the effect of loss in agriculture share of employment. We see that in the low emission scenario, the agriculture's share of employment without crop change is negative. The region presents a decrease in agriculture share of employment, and in the high emission scenario, there is not much variation in the share. But when we have the agricultural adaptation, what we see is an increase in the share of employment in that sector in the South macro region of Brazil. So in conclusion, our results suggest a spatial redistribution of crop production under future climate conditions, helping mitigate some of the effects of climate change on agricultural share of employment. But agricultural adaptation will likely have minimal effects on aggregate microregion migration. Regional differences on the effects of climate are to be expected, with the Northeast macroregion predicted to have the more significant increase in out-migration rates and decrease in agriculture share of employment, whereas the South macroregion is where crop change is likely to impact the agriculture share of employment the most. Okay, so that's what I had to present, and thank you all.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this very nice paper and presentation. So I think it's going to be a challenge for me to present after these 2 papers. So let me share my screen. Okay, sure. Okay, is it full screen for everyone?
Yes.
Great. Perfect. So the paper that I'm going to present, it's a paper that's joint work with James Hammett and Christoph Reinberg. And the idea that we're going to present, I'm going to talk a lot about the value per statistical life. So I'm going to define what's that in just a sec. But the idea is when you're trying to evaluate policies such as, for example, a climate mitigation policy, as we're discussing in the 2 different papers, a way to measure what's the benefits that you can gain from improving the risks specifically to health and to life. So could be done using this value per statistical life. And that name's a little bit misleading. So value per statistical life is really just a trade-off between wealth and really mortality risks. So you could try to get that measure either by reveal preferences. So say, for example, that you're going to see what people are doing and trying to infer from their choices what's the trade-off. So typically in the States, for example, they use as a gold standard what the people are actually willing to accept in terms of compensation to getting for a more riskier job in terms of mortality. So they use that risk parameter to elicit the value per statistical life. There's a second possibility that you can actually go ahead and ask people to create a hypothetical market. How much are they willing to pay for improvement of their survival probability? Now, with respect to stated preferences, really the key challenge in stated preferences is to get respondents to understand that those probabilities that we're going to be asking them. And typically, it's actually small probabilities that are presented to respondents. Now, the literature has developed many ways in order to try to improve respondents' understanding, such as visual analog scale, like the risk ladders or verbal analogies. So for example, say that you want to make your respondent of your survey understand what is a mortality risk, in particular for a risk of dying in a car accident. You're going to present them with this picture and you're going to explain to the respondent, look, each cell that you have here actually represents one specific individual. Now, say, for example, that the average value per these 110,000 individuals is that 5 of them are going to die. So, and you color 5 of those cells by a color red. And then you propose a policy, say, for example, that you're going to reduce the speed in the highways by 30 kilometers, for example. And that's going to allow you to reduce that mortality probability by 2. And hence you explain to the respondent that there's a chance of that reduction just colored 2 of those cells and in blue. Now, typically, what the papers in the literature trying to elicit value per statistical life do is that they deal with this type of very small risk. So we're talking about 1 in 1,000 or even 1 in 1,000,000 risk reduction. Now, there's really 2 main reasons why we're dealing with those type of mortality risks. So a practical reason is, well, this is the type of mortality risk that your average individual in society that has 40 years old, for example, faces. So they're relatively small. And then there's a second reason, which is that with a small risk reduction, actually theory predicts that your willingness to pay should be actually only proportional to the proposed risk reduction. So that means that, for example, if Mario is willing to pay 2 reales for a mortality risk reduction of 110,000, he should be willing to pay approximated 4 or a little bit less reales for a mortality risk reduction twice the size. Now, this is what's typically called a strong scope sensitivity test. Now, it is not really a surprise for researchers that work in this area to find that actually the papers don't find this strong scope sensitivity. They do find that it's scope sensitive in the sense that people are willing to pay more for a larger risk reduction, but actually the literature actually fails to find its really strong scope sensitivity. Now, we believe that there are at least 2 reasons why we find this scope insensitivity or this lack of strong scope sensitivity. And the first reason is because there's a curvature of the utility function, and there's really 2 effects that I'm going to explain in a couple of slides that are the income and the dead anyway effect. And the second is, well, it could be also that respondents are really not understanding what the good that's being valued in your hypothetical market, and hence they're really not reacting to that. Now, an alternative to that is like, okay, well, if people are not really understanding the risk reduction, could it be that the risk reduction is actually just so small that people either do not understand it or don't pay attention to that? Now, a possibility would be, well, let's try to increase the risk reduction. So in order to do that, you actually require a baseline risk, which is much, much larger. So for example, take cancer. So the average mortality rate conditionally on having cancer is around 60%. Now, imagine that you can propose a certain epigenetic treatment so that you can reduce from 60% to a sizable 20% reduction in your conditional mortality risk, that's actually something that it may be easier for respondents to understand in a setting that is actually already a credible setting. Now, the key question, the key problem is that why actually we're not doing this, because once you propose very large risk reductions, such as the one that you have in the slide here, there's the two effects that I was talking to you about, this income effect and this dead anyway effect, that really come in and kick in pretty hard. So basically, what we want to ask is, as a research question, is that whether can we use these non-marginal risk reductions to elicit VSL? So in this value per statistical life, really, it's a marginal concept. It's a marginal rate of substitution between mortality risk on one hand and wealth on the other. So that's really something that when you change infinitesimally your mortality risk, you should be able to obtain your VSL. So we want to link this non-marginality aspect with the VSL. And the way that we're going to do that is by setting out a theoretical willingness to pay model for for reducing, for a treatment that reduces both your incidence, either you get it or not, if you get it, your conditional mortality, and your severity as well. And our key modeling strategy is really to understand the relationship between the willingness to pay and the baseline risk on one hand, and the willingness to pay and the income on the other. And what we're going to do is that we're going to test out predictions using a Monte Carlo simulation study on a credible ASP study. So we based our results on a ASP study that has already been done. However, we're currently developing an instrument survey in order to test what we're doing. Now, there are two sets of results in this paper. Now, on one hand, we have that we propose a correction to compute the value per statistical life, taking into account dead anyways effects and income effects, so that you can actually do that with any type of risk reduction, let it be small or let it be very big. And we tested using, again, a credible contingent valuation setting or a stated preference setting for a small unconditional risk of death and a large conditional risk of death. And we actually show that in that specific setting, we find biases of 40%, as opposed to when you propose very small risk reductions, both unconditionally and conditionally. And we find that our correction actually works. So we managed to correct for that bias of 40%. Now, what we have here in terms of modeling is actually a relatively simple model in which we allow an individual to derive utility from wealth and health. And we propose really very standard assumptions such as non-satiation. The more you have of health and wealth, the better. Weak risk aversion, both to wealth and health as well. And consider that we are in a setting in which there's a disease that can affect your health. So if you get the disease, you get disease with a probability of Q, and then conditionally on fundamental, the individual faces a probability. So for example, when you get cancer, there's a high chance that you may die from cancer. Now, if you survive, you're gonna get a chronic health state that it's going to be denoted by H. And there are really three state dependent, or three states in this model. One in which you're in perfect health, the other one in which you're going to be in this chronic health state, but you survive. And the other one is that of equivalent at being dead. So that's basically the utility that you derive from bequests. Now, as you can see from an ex-ante point of view, the individual suspected utility is really given by this very standard form, which is basically, if you survive, you're gonna get conditionally on surviving or not getting the disease. Basically, you're gonna get this utility. If you get the disease, you can either end up in the health state as equivalent to being dead, or you can survive that disease. Now, suppose that there's a treatment that is going to improve your probability of getting ill by either by theta Q, of dying by theta rho, and of improving your health state by theta H. So just to give you a little bit of a figure, now a little bit of numbers. So imagine that we're considering again cancer, and the chances of getting cancer could be relatively small, 2%. But once you get the cancer, then either you survive it with 65% probability or you die with 35% probability. And what this treatment is going to do is basically it's going to improve your incidence, your conditional survival, and also you're going to pass from a severe state to a mild chronic health state. So basically what a contingent valuation is going to do is that or a stated preference is going to do is try to elicit what's the individual's maximum willingness to pay for this specific treatment. And typically what's done is like, they're going to ask, well, how much are you willing to pay for that specific treatment? And if yes, the idea is to elicit this willingness to pay. So if the utility is well behaved, you should expect something like this, that the willingness to pay should be increasing in concave with respect to the risk reduction. So this is that just units, monetary units. And the typical way that you ask a question is, or you elicit a question that you ask for a specific mortality risk reduction, and then the individuals are going to tell you one specific willingness to pay. Now, why do we do this? Well, basically, we want to obtain this value per statistical life measure, right? But where is the value per statistical life measure in this specific figure? So it's just here. So basically, what we typically do in order to approximate the value per statistical life measure is by taking this willingness to pay and then dividing it by this mortality risk reduction. And so the idea is to get this slope. So the smaller you get your risk reduction, the closer you're going to get to the green slope. Okay. And now, of course, what would happen if you go ahead and you ask an individual or a respondent to your sample a large risk reduction? So probably he's going to tell you about this willingness to pay. But as you can clearly see, it's really a bad approximation. Just to give you a little bit of equations. So when you derive this model in order to obtain this compensating variation, which is how much this maximum willingness to pay that is going to leave you indifferent between accepting the treatment and getting the risk reductions and paying for it, of course, and not getting the treatment, well, you're going to end up with this marginal willingness to pay. So this is the case for incidence. So this is, and it's actually pretty intuitive if you see the equation. So what you have in the numerator, it's basically what you gain if you improve your incidence probability. So this is in terms of utils, and what you gain is, well, if you improve your incidence, you have a higher chance of ending up in a perfect health state. If you don't, if you get sick, then this is the average probability of or the average utility that you get by not getting sick. And then you derive, and and the denominator is actually just a measure of the opportunity cost, which is going to transform everything in terms of monetary units. And you can do that also for mortality risk and for the severity as well. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about what are these effects that are going to be biasing our results if you want to focus on value per statistical life. So if you take, for example, it's focusing on incidence reduction. So this is the marginal willingness to pay to improve your incidence. And if you take a first order Taylor approximation, what you end up is like with these three terms. So this guy in green here, this is the marginal willingness to pay evaluated really at a zero risk reduction. So this is the green slope that I showed you in the graph. This is what we really want as a policy decision maker in order to make your cost-benefit analysis or regulatory impact assessment of different policies. And you have this blue and this red term that come in. So this blue term is what's called the dead anyway effect. So the dead anyway effect is like, if you get a risk reduction, that means that you're going to survive with a larger probability. But if you are going to survive with a larger probability, what you're going to do is that you're not going to be willing to pay that much for that risk reduction because your survival probability is actually higher. So that is going to push down on your value here. On the other hand, if you, this on the term in red is going to be the income effect. It's basically the more you pay, the less you're going to be willing to pay because you're going to become poorer. So that would be the income effect. So notice that if you want to control for these two guys here and just to obtain the value per statistical life, which is this green term here, well, if you propose a very small risk reduction, this guy and this guy actually go to zero. So that's because that's the reason why you actually get a pretty good approximation. However, if you propose a large reduction, these guys are going to kick in. All right. Now, in order to correct or to try to correct for this income and debt anyway effects, what we're going to do is that we're going to understand better the relationship between the willingness to pay, so the C here, and how it changes with the baseline risks, which is Q in this specific case. And notice that if you take just the derivative of the willingness to pay with respect to Q, there's the three terms that appear. So you have the term in blue, which is how that represents the debt anyway effect. You have the term in green, which is what we really want, which is this value per statistical life, and you have the term in red, which is the income effect. Now, you have an additional term here, which is the term in black, that I'm going to speak about it in just 30 seconds. But notice that you just by reshuffling this and actually isolating the term in green, you find an exact equation, which tells you, look, if you rearrange these three terms, you're going to end up with the value per statistical life. Now, what the term in black represents, it's what currently the stated preference is trying to elicit value per statistical life are using as an approximation. So this is the line that the first line that I showed you, that you take the willingness to pay, you divide that by the amount of the risk reduction, and then you end up with your approximation of the green term, which works if your risk reduction is actually pretty small. Once you propose it, which is pretty large, then we know that this black term actually is not a good approximation. But notice that regardless of the size of the risk reduction, this equation should hold at every point in time or so we're going to exploit that. Now I've been talking about incidence and conditional mortality and severity. Well, this is a model that has three different health states, and really the value per statistical life, this is the standard definition in the literature. So this is you comparing a state of perfect health, again, a state of equivalent of that of being debt or bequest utility, and then you divide it by this opportunity cost of time. But now in order to obtain that in this specific model, you just need to do a small manipulation in order to just to compensate for the fact that you might end up in this third health state, which is a chronic health state. So that's basically the idea. But what's important here is the color coding. So if you want to obtain this value per statistical life, everything needs to be in terms in green. So notice that this guy and this guy, yes, this is the marginal bonus to pay for incidence. This is the marginal bonus to pay for conditional mortality, for improving both of those conditions. Well, at the end, you can reobtain those two by integrating both the debt anyway effect and the income effect in this specific way. Now, what's a better point is like, why is it that people have not done this so far? Well, if you look at the literature for now, this is readily available. So the black term, because that's currently what's being done. This is also available, but people actually don't exploit the variation in the baseline mortality risk, which is highly necessary in order to obtain this green term here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to use these equations to see whether this actually works and holds in a Monte Carlo simulation setting. And the idea is really just to construct 1,000 different data sets, which with 5,000 simulating individuals. And I'm going to assume a CRRA, a utility shape. That for each individual, I'm just going to solve for the willingness to pay by proposing one treatment, which is again going to improve both the incidence, mortality, and severity as well. And I want to propose two really different scenarios, one with very small risk reductions, so less than 1 in 1,000 for both incidence and conditional mortality risks, and one other scenario with very large risk reduction, so in the order of 1 over 100 for incidence risk and 1 in 10 for conditional mortality risk. So you can, this one would be the car example, this one would be the cancer example. So those are two very true conditions that for which this size of risk reductions can actually occur. And the typical specification that is used in the literature is the following one. So it's one, well, it depends whether you're able to obtain the willingness to pay with a precise number or not. But here we assume that we do. And at the end, you can just do a log-log specification. And the color coding still holds. So the coefficients in blue are the coefficients that are going to represent the relationship between the space-time risk and the willingness to pay. The term in red, income effect, and terms in black, it's what's currently been using, what the literature has been using in order to approximate for the marginal willingness to pay that we have been using. All right, so at the end, it's because you obtain a log-log model. At the end, you need to do a little bit of retransformation of your coefficients to obtain your coefficients or your willingness to pay, or your marginal willingness to pay. And at the end, the corrected estimates, you would need to compute them in the following way so that you obtain the different estimates in this way. All right. So just to give you a little bit of results, so at the end, the sizes of the numbers here are represented in millions for incidence and mortality, for thousands in severity. And you have for each component 198. So given that we know the model, we know what needs to be the exact value that we should be obtaining. So we have the OLS estimate. So the OLS is really what the literature is currently doing, and this is our proposed correction right now. Now we have the two scenarios, one which is called marginal and the other that is called non-marginal. What we obtain is, like, if you look at across over all the settings, when you compare for the marginals, both our solution and what the current literature is doing, there's really no difference whatsoever. And that's normal because the approximation is actually done pretty good. However, once you propose something that is actually much larger, then it doesn't make too much sense to do what the current literature is doing because there's a big bias. It's a bias of around 40%. So our proposal actually, it's actually pretty close to what the model predicts it should be. So it's actually working our correction. And these are the values for the value per statistical life, which uses the equation that I showed you at the beginning. And at the end, we again find that our solution is actually pretty good in order to approximate that. So just to conclude, what this paper is doing is building or proposing a way to the literature in order to compute the value per statistical life with larger risk reductions that may be more understandable to respondents. We do so we test it in a credible stated preference setting that proposes really small unconditional risks of that and large conditional risk of that. So it's like a cancer situation. And we are able to correct for this large bias that arises if you just go ahead and do what the current literature is doing. So what we're actually doing right now is constructing a survey instrument in order to test out this data. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening to me. And now I open the floor for questions, discussions. Let's start with the audience. Maybe if you have any questions or discussions for all the panelists. Okay, maybe not. So I have a question for you, Mario. So basically, well, I have a couple of questions, to be honest. So the first one is, so if I understand correctly, your boom, so you approximate your boom, it's like really like a continuous variable, right? In which you are, the higher the exposure, the higher the boom, right? But my question is, well, would it be possible? So given the figure that I saw, which is increasing and then decreasing in terms of the pricing, right? So I would expect that your exposure measure is going to increase and decrease, right? So is it possible to find like asymmetric effects on all your different outcomes that you're looking at, so that there's actually, I don't know, a rigidity in terms of adaptations, whether you're actually increasing, maybe you're going to increase more the greenhouse gases, but if that exposure measure decreases with time, well, we should find that your greenhouse gases decreases, I guess. But is that the case?
So what? Yes, we do build a continuous measure. So yes, you are right when you say, for instance, that when prices go up, the exposure index goes up, but we are fixing the shares of exposure to each municipality in time, in the beginning of the period. So municipalities are not, they're not changing their share of exposure in time. What is changing is the value of exposure, let's say. So
Okay.
yeah, so for instance, when prices go down, what is happening is that the commodity exposure is going down. But when that happens, usually also there's an accommodation in the main variables. So that's why we have such a clear positive relationship between the variables that we present. Okay.
Okay.
But so is that clearer now? I don't know if
Yeah,
I
yeah,
answered.
yeah. No, the yes, thank you. But then the other question was, could you or have you actually looked at whether an increase is the same as a decrease? Because for now it's like symmetric. You're assuming that increase impacts the same as a decrease, right? So I would imagine that that's not the case, but I wonder if you have already tested that.
That's something that we could test. Yes. What we did is we tested for different time periods. So for checking whether or not time of a period of, for instance, no increasing prices would have the same impact on the variables of interest. And what we find is that they do not. So for instance, when you analyze the 1980s and the 1990s for deforestation, and in the 1990s, you had some increasing prices for commodities in the world, but in the 1980s you didn't. So what we find is that there are no effects when you build the same exposure index for these time periods, and you run all the models again. We don't find a clear effect as we do for this time of commodity booms. So I think that's evidence suggesting what you just proposed, but I think we could take a deeper look into it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. So my guess, another question that probably you already did because you did a lot of different robustness checks, but it seems to me that when you're adapting, it needs a little bit of time, right? So if there's an increase in the exposure, so my guess is that it should take a while to have like an adaptation. I don't know how it works, how fast you're going to adapt. But that would be nice to check if, for example, there's a couple of lags of the exposure measure is going to have an impact or not. So maybe you have already done it, but and if you have,
no, that's a good suggestion. What we did is we did an analysis for pre-trains, but we didn't do, for instance, a lagged comparison. So, for instance, a couple of years, and that's something that it could be done because sometimes, especially when it comes to temporary crops, farmers might change temporary crops yearly if they analyze that there is an opportunity or a threat, depending on the situation, of course. So that's something that we could do. Yes. So thank you for the suggestion. I'm gonna.
No, it's a great paper, great data, honestly. It's super nice. So I guess I have another question, but this is for Gabriel. So great model. So my guess is that I need to read your paper more in detail, but I have a question. Do you know where, like, have you a better understanding about what's the variation that allows you to identify the different coefficients that you're finding? Because it's a little bit opaque, but oh look, it's a presentation of 25 minutes, so I think it's all, of course, it's gonna be opaque. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so for the agriculture firm, when we try to understand the elasticity of the crop shares, we have to use a cross-section analysis. So what we have there are the crop shares at each locality in Brazil at that point in time, and what we are seeing in variation is the price. No, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the price and the crop suitabilities, which are varying across location in crops.
It's the farm gate price.
Yes, the farm gate price.
Okay.
But in the rest of the paper, what we have is mostly panel data information from the Brazilian decennial census from 1980 to 2010.
Okay.
So
okay, got it.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense. So so I had a question also with respect to the land shares. So basically, is the assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the impression that the assumption that you're doing is that every firm produces every single crop in some proportion, right? But they produce everything. So could it be the case that there's really just crops that they're not going to be produced? It's like I understand that that introduces a kink, but I guess that would make sense. Well, it depends on what you have on your data, right? Is everything produced everywhere, or
No, it is not. And even Mario has information on that, right? Not every, because we are not looking at the firm level, we are looking at the micro region level. And some crops, they just are not produced in some places. But our basic assumption is that there should be a marginal production of the crop that places, except if the crop suitability is zero for that region. But we observe much more zeros in the data than the predicted crop suitability zeros. So that's a problem, and we need to try to understand how to model it in a better way, so we can overcome this issue.
I do have a question as well, Gabriel, for you. So you showed two maps, one of maize and the other one of coffee suitability, I think. And there is a change in the future due to climate change on where you can grow maize and where you can grow coffee. Now, my doubt is very technical, let's say, because maize production in Brazil is usually a second crop after soybeans. And with the change in climate, most likely there is a possibility that our rain window will decrease. Yes. And I don't know if that's taken into account somehow in the data. I don't know if the GAES data takes that into account. That's the question, actually. Do they? I mean, or
I'm not. I'm not sure really, but that's a good point about how the two crops tend to be produced together during the year period. The guys that they use the rain, of course, and the rain throughout the year. But I'm not sure if in their crop productivity measure, the rain window is for the
It's the same
for the crop is the same as the one that is actually used. But that's something that we should investigate, of course.
So it's something that came up because last year Brazil had a lot of problems with the second crop, and I was just thinking about what will happen in the future, like with climate change and everything. Danielle, I do have a question for you as well. You mentioned that there is a problem with surveys to test empirically your model, but then you are now doing a survey. I think from what I understood from your last slide, you are conducting a survey to test it. So can you just comment on that?
Sure.
Please?
Yeah. So there are three things that you need in order to apply error correction. You need variation in the risk reduction, which is that typically it's what you actually do in this type of surveys. You need variation in the income, which it's not exogenous, but you basically ask to people like different incomes. So there is variation in that. And the third variation is the variation in baseline risk. So it's like you have a different baseline risk than I do. But the problem is like literally the literature does not ask that. So you could, and there are some papers that do, but those papers that do actually propose very small risk reductions, which is like, it doesn't make sense to apply error correction. Well, it does make, you could, but at the end, it yields more or less the same. But the thing is, so you need those three sources of variation. And right now, there are really no papers that do them. I don't really understand why, to be honest. But so that's the reason why we're actually doing a new survey instrument in order to implement that baseline risks. So it could be because basically, in order to vary your baseline risks, that would be, you need to make it credible. So one way of varying your baseline risk is to ask you, Mario, okay, what's your belief of getting cancer in the like next 20 years? And then I can ask the same to Gabriel. And there I'm gonna have a little bit of variation that I could use. So that's one of the alternatives that we're considering right now, or we're just considering to give you a different baseline risks to you and to Gabriel directly, like exogenously. Because if I ask you, it's gonna be completely endogenous. So I need to control for that endogeneity. So that's the reason why. So I think it's there. I think that people just didn't realize that you could actually find BSL using this, like the three sources of variation, and hence the reason why it has not been asked before.
All right. Okay.
Is it better?
Yeah. Much better. Another question. So the main application of your paper will be to the insurance market, or am I misreading?
No, Mario. What you're currently doing in Gabriel, that would be the application.
Yeah,
everything that affects health
risk
and wealth, health risks and life risks, that's going to be implemented. It's implemented a lot in the States when they're evaluating every single regulation that has been implemented by the EPA. So they use the value per statistical life in order to measure the benefits of air pollution and type of policies, or any type of policies that has public funds and that deals and impacts health or life. And that's really a measure that is super useful. My guess is that in Latin America, so at least in Colombia, the value per statistical life, it's not a lot used. And the reason why is that because they are not doing a lot of cost benefit analysis. And because at the end, if you want to implement a policy, it's either political decision or you just don't evaluate that, right? In the States and in France, now they're actually requiring cost-benefit analysis in order to like have implement or not investment decisions, regardless of whether you're in the health sector or you're in the automobile sector, whatever. You need to do a cost-benefit analysis, and hence you actually need these value per statistical life values and so on. So it's actually pretty good to do cost benefit analysis, but you need the inputs. So basically, we're providing those inputs.
All right. All right.
Very
Thank you.
nice.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
Very nice.
Well, I think it's Gabriel, Mario, thank you very much. Great papers, great presentations. So nice.
Yeah, well,
it's a pleasure meeting you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meeting you both.
It's a pleasure meeting you too, and hope to see you